Welcome to this key and pivotal lesson, the form lighting principle. The form lighting principle really is the core foundational principle we as artists use to help us color and help us paint our work to varying degrees of believability. So we base all of our lighting knowledge pretty much on the form lighting principle foundationally. And then we add extra bits of information as we need it on top of this. So this really is our foundational principle for lighting. Now, I'm going to be doing this step by step. Don't worry too much about how I'm doing it, how I'm using Photoshop or how I'm using the tools. That is covered later on in the course. For now, focus on each of the individual elements of the form lighting principle. Let me also say this, and hopefully I'll remind you at the end as well. You want to remember every single element of this off by heart. And let me say that if you can remember it off by heart and how it kind of works in the form lighting principle, you have a very, very strong foundation in painting already. All right, so let's get started. In front of us here, we have just a gray circle. This gray circle is going to become a sphere. So what we're seeing is the sphere without any lighting. And all we see is its inherent value, which is about a 5 on the value scale, and its inherent color. In this instance, we've gone with just a gray. So its color and its value are very similar. Okay, so it's a 5 on the value scale and its inherent color is gray. And what we need to do is determine or define a light source. Okay, so we are going to say, let's put the light source top left, and we'll just draw in a little kind of 3D arrow here, just indicating where the light is. Okay, so our light's coming from the top left. And now that we have a light source, something starts to happen. All right, we're going to start seeing form shadows occur where the light does not touch. So I'm selecting this shape, this circular shape here. And I'm going to grab the soft brush and gently add in, based on the planes of the form. Now, obviously, a circle has gazillion trillions of planes. Nevertheless, we're going to kind of wing it, put in some form shadows. All right, darken it here in the areas where it gets pretty dark. And you can see immediately how what we've learned about the two-value statement and just the power of light and shadow, what that can do to something so simple like a circle. It has effectively turned it into a sphere already, and yet we haven't even done all the other elements of the form lighting principle yet. So remember again how important the two-value statement really is. Even if you look at the thumbnail view, if you had to show this to some random person and say, hey, what do you think this is? They'll go, well, it looks like a gray ball, or maybe it's a gray planet, or it's a gray sphere, right? They wouldn't say, oh, well, it's just a gray circle. And that is the power of shadows and light in terms of the area here that is our base local value. Okay, so those are form shadows, and they are shadows that appear on the form once the form is lit. Okay, the form shadows. Next, we're going to add ambient occlusion shadows. Now, ambient occlusion shadows, the name kind of hints as to what the purpose or how this shadow comes about. So first of all, ambient refers to the type of lighting. So these shadows are caused by the ambient lighting, not the direct lighting. So the direct lighting causes the form shadows, but the ambient occlusion shadows are caused by the ambient lighting around the area or the environment of the object. And occlusion refers to light being cut off, so light not appearing somewhere. So when we understand occlusion shadows, which we'll get into just now, which is kind of like a space between your fingers or the darkness underneath your shoes when you're standing on the ground, it's almost pitch black. Occlusion just means to occlude, to stop the light coming there. And of course, shadows just indicates that it's the ambient occlusion shadows. Now, ambient occlusion shadows are kind of weird. I'm probably explaining it in a strange way. But what's important to know is that ambient occlusion shadows appear to us when the edges of a form tend to turn. So the sphere tends to go over around into the back sections of the sphere, right? There's a back and a front and a side, etc. And so what happens is ambient occlusion shadows are very subtle shadows that kind of appear around the edges of forms like this. And they help us to kind of get a sense of the turning of the form, all right? The turning of the plane. Okay, and you can see it kind of enhances the overall spherical look. I just want to be a little bit more subtle here. And that's also a hint as well. You want to be subtle with them. They're not supposed to be overly harsh shadows. Okay. Let's just get that in there. Okay, that seems nice. All right. So those are our ambient occlusion shadows. The purpose of them, once again, is to show the turning of a form. If an object or a shape that you have drawn does in fact turn, or is a rounded form, even if it's a square form, if it turns or it has another side, you want to have a degree of ambient occlusion. It is a shadow that is being formed by the occluded ambient light. Okay, let's move on to the next element. What we're going to do here is we're going to add just light, a general level of additional light before we get to the highlight. Now, the light often is just formed automatically in this region, right? It's just formed automatically because we've shone a light source, it's created the form shadows, and you already kind of have a light zone. And you can see in the thumbnail, we already kind of have a light zone there. But we're going to add this stage as well because it's also very useful when we're painting and we're coloring to think about light as a stage. Now, let me just reiterate once again. You don't want to think of painting as adding light, adding shadow. I want to really encourage you to think about get the right inherent value and inherent color and just add the shadow, and you've saved yourself a lot of drama and a lot of steps in trying to make it look 3D by working on making sure your shadows read correctly. Anyway, let us add this light. I'm going to select that local color there, and I'm going to increase the value maybe by 1 or 2 stops. And we're just going to beam some light onto that section. And our ball looks a little bit more 3D now. Okay, so that is the light, and the light is obviously coming from the light source. We're lighting a zone. Let's go to our next layer, if you will, or our next element of lighting, which is the highlight. Now, the highlight generally occurs at only specific points. Another way I want you to think about a highlight is think of a mountain range. And there is one mountain that is the tallest mountain. Let's call it the peak of the mountain, right? The mountain, the peak amongst peaks. Think of the highlight like that. When you start putting a lot of highlights all over something, they don't really seem like highlights anymore. They seem like really bright little markings on whatever you're doing. The term highlight really comes from the highest point of light, right? Sort of like the highest peak in the mountain range. So be very... so use highlights very sparingly. Okay, and what we're going to do is now select that light color, increase its value, and we're going to sort of add a little bit of a smaller highlight here, one location where the light is brightest. Okay, you can even go a little bit brighter in the core there. All right, in the center of that little shape. Okay, fine. So that is the highlight. But there is still work yet to be done. What I'm going to do now is go behind our sphere, and I'm going to draw a cast shadow. All right, let's do a cast shadow like this. That seems reasonable enough for an example. Okay, and cast shadows, important thing to remember with cast shadows is cast shadows are transparent. All right, they're pretty much transparent. You don't really want to do them opaque. It'll look weird having this weird, really harsh, dark black shadow over something, unless, of course, you're doing that for an intentional kind of reason. But it's important to remember cast shadows are transparent, but they are usually quite dark. Another point to note is that the edge of the cast shadow is sharp in very clear, bright light, and it can be a little bit fuzzy when the light is diffused. So, for example, think of a fluorescent lighting. Think of a very cloudy day. Shadows don't tend to have very sharp edges when it's a cloudy day, okay, when the light is diffused. But in sharp, bright light or general normal lighting circumstances, the cast shadows tend to have a sharp edge. Now, the thing to remember with cast shadows is that they are casting off from the form. So as the light beams past the form, areas where the light does not hit, the cast shadow is formed. It's sort of pretty pretty obvious in a way. At the same time, you want to think about how a cast shadow might look based on how the light is moving past the form. That is the cast shadow. All right, cast shadow. We've just put that layer underneath our sphere just for convenience sake as we're working. Next, we want to talk about reflected or bounce lighting. Okay. So I'm just selecting our sphere again here. And we are going to grab a bit of the light here from this surface, which is now kind of a white table or our white environment. Because as the light shines down, some of the light shines down past our sphere, hits the table surface, and then bounces up again to the back of the form, right? And this is our reflected or bounce light, which we've already learned about a little bit already when we had done the elements of light, right? The sources, the light sources. So what I'm going to do is just do a gentle, soft, whoops, wrong brush, do a gentle, a very subtle spray of this reflected light in that shadowed area there. And the key thing to remember with reflected light is that it generally appears only in the shadows. So bounce light / reflected light tends to really show itself only in the shadows. Now, why is that? Well, because it's reflected light, it is a lot less bright than the actual light source itself. And so if there was reflected light in the light areas, which there is, you simply cannot see it because the light areas are being overpowered and blasted with the direct light source. So our reflected light is firmly seen in the shadow areas. I'm going to add another light element here, which we will call our secondary light. Okay. And our secondary light could be the sky if you're outside, or it could be another globe if you have an orange globe in the room and then a red globe in the room. The red globe being a slightly less powerful, maybe a more distant light source, it would still shine its light would still reach our object. This is our secondary light source. It's secondary to the primary or the key light source. Here I'm just going to hint at it just a little bit on this outer edge. All right, we're going to say that there's a secondary light source to the right. Now, it's different from the reflected light because it can be brighter, and secondary light sources based on their brightness can also be seen in the light. It just depends on the lighting setup. And as we do that, let's add our secondary light source in here as well, so that we're kind of aware that there is a secondary light source coming from the right. Maybe it's really far away and a little bit distant. Okay. All right, our secondary light source. It's weaker. And I'll just put here second so that we know it's our secondary light source. And I'll just say primary here, or key light source. Okay, we've got one more thing we need to do in our form lighting principle, and that is the occlusion shadow. Now, whenever an object touches another object, generally speaking, you get an occlusion shadow happening there where light just simply does not get to, right? The light is itself occluded. Let's just put that in there. Firmly occlusion shadows. And I'm going to select our sphere here. I'm just hiding the selection so it doesn't get in the way while we're working. I'm going to select a dark shadow color. I'll just even select black. I'm going to be subtle with it because there is a lot of curvature happening underneath our sphere. So you'd only have a little bit of an area with the occlusion shadow. But it would be there something like that. That's a little bit too lacking in subtlety. But there we go. All right. And those, in fact, are all the elements of the form lighting principle. And we use these elements when we're painting a particular thing to determine what elements we want to add and take away based on the lighting scenario of that particular object. Now, when you're dealing with various types of art, maybe you're going for a very cartoony look. You may not use all of the elements of the lighting workflow, right? You may use none of them. You may just do completely flat color. But if you want to bring in more and more dimensions, you want to use more and more of the form lighting principle. So let's discuss this principle now with just some key notes on what's going on here. And we also want to start to try and see how a workflow, how we might work and implement coloring, might be derived from this particular principle. All right. So what we want to do first is kind of split the families here. And we have the light family and we have the shadow family. And things from the light and the shadow family do not cross into each other, generally speaking. For example, we do not have values from the light family occurring in the shadow family's areas. It just doesn't happen. The values are completely separate. Why? Well, if we remember our two value statement, everything needs to boil down to the two values. And obviously, if we have values from the shadow zone and the light zone, values from the light zone and the shadow zone, everything becomes a blurry mess and we can't read the forms anymore. So that is the reason these families are in effect at war, you could say. And in the light family, we have our base or local color and value. We have our lit area, and we also have our highlight, right? And we want to remember, we don't want to go crazy with highlights. That is almost the instant sign of an amateur or someone who really doesn't understand form lighting principle. They just have highlights on everything, like the character or whatever they're drawing or painting. It's just super glossy and stuff. It just looks really weird. Okay, so those are the elements of our light family. And crazy thing is, you'd think the light family would be this crazy huge family. They've only got these three members, really. Everything else is part of the shadow family. Once again, emphasizing how important shadows are. And then in the shadow family side, although yes, we do have the ambient occlusion sort of occurring in the shadow family side, it's a little bit different, but nevertheless, it's lighter. It's part of the shadow family. We have our ambient occlusion shadows. Oh yes, mind you, also in the light family would be the secondary light source as well, obviously, because it itself is a light. Okay, so we have the ambient occlusion shadows in the shadow family. We have the form shadows, which are really our base shadows. And when you're doing shadowing, you mainly want to focus on your form shadows. I'll put a number 1 there, and number 2, and your ambient occlusion shadows when you're just working with your base value and base color, and you have the desire to create that 3D form, work just with your form shadows, and your ambient occlusion shadows, work those until it looks 3D. Don't worry about the other elements yet. Okay, we have our occlusion shadows. And I'm reiterating this for your sake so that you're getting used to the idea of all these elements. And we're going to list it out on the left as well. That's not to waste your time. It's because we want to derive a workflow from this. It's all good and well learning the form lighting principle, but can you use it in an actual piece of art? That's the real question. All right, I just had a sip of water there. Okay, so this is our reflected light, also called bounce light. That's because the light shines down and then it bounces off the surface and back onto the object, right? At whatever angle it is in relation to the object. Key thing to note here is reflected and bounce light are part of the shadow family, right? Because these lights occur in the shadows. You see them in the shadows. Even if scientifically they are occurring in the light, you do not see them in the light. So in the terms of an art, we want to be mindful that they are occurring in the shadow areas, all right? Just doing an arrow there to our secondary light source. And then we have our cast shadows, which are cast by the form. Important to remember, they are transparent. All right. So when you start looking at all of these elements in a list sort of fashion, we kind of have our base, local color, and value. Then we have our form shadows, our ambient occlusion shadows, then our lights, highlights, reflected lights, we can add secondary lights at this point as well in the workflow. Occlusion shadows, and our cast shadows. Let's make sure we've all got them all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, there we go. We've got all of them there. Now, something important to note is look at where the cast shadows are. Look at where the occlusion shadows are. They're lost, and this is very important. You don't want to be painting in cast shadows somewhere in the beginning because you're going to end up painting or coloring over them. And that would be weird because cast shadows cast over things usually. If an arm is over a character's head, you want to have painted the head and then do the cast shadow over that, right? So it's very important. But in essence, this is how we get our general lighting workflow. Okay, our general lighting workflow. I hope this has been a very useful and very to the point form lighting principle lesson. Learn it well, learn all of these elements off by heart, get it over and done with, and you will thank me later. That's the end of the lesson, and I'll see you in the next lesson.